Welcome to Feminist Question Time today. This is brought to you by Women's Human Rights Campaign. It's an international feminist organisation that promotes women's rights. The main aim is on defending women's sex-based rights against the threats posed by gender identity ideology. You can find more information on our website, womensdeclaration.com, where you will find our declaration on women's sex-based rights, which has been signed by 15,442 people from 129 countries and is supported by 314 organisations. We're going to start off with Laoise from Ireland, who is the founder and spokesperson of the Countess Didn't Fight for This. And we're going to hear about her organisation, which has signed the Declaration on Sex-Based Rights, and what you're doing. So what is your organisation, Laoise?
Hello. Firstly, I want to say thank you so much for having us take part in your International Women's Day event. We are incredibly proud to be official signatories to the Women's Declaration on Sex-Based Rights, and we are in huge admiration. We have huge admiration for your work, so very many thanks. The Countess Didn't Fight for Us is a voluntary, non-partisan human rights and advocacy group. We operate in Ireland, though we have members abroad, diaspora, and people who have just taken an interest in what's happening on the ground in Ireland. We were founded, I founded the Countess a year ago, and like many of us here today, possibly we had many Zoom meetings privately before we launched 5 months ago at the end of September. And I can't believe sometimes it was only 5 months ago because it feels like 5 years.
Laoise, what was it that made you found the organisation, and also who's the Countess? What did she fight for?
Well, the Countess is a figure in Irish history. She was an extraordinary woman. She, I feel very strongly, that she transgressed every single barrier of class, race and sex in her lifetime. Her life was extraordinarily episodic. So she was born in great privilege and luxury as a member of the aristocracy, the ascendancy, we call it in Ireland, which was the ruling class. And she grew up in the west of Ireland, and she would have had a governess, and she was a great horsewoman. But then what happened to her, which I think is very important for women doing this work, is she politicized and she radicalized, and she, by the time of the 1913 shipyard lockouts in Dublin, she was manning soup kitchens and she was fully politicized. And then in 1916, there was a revolution in Ireland, the 1916 uprising, and by that stage, she was a military commander. And in fact, she was sentenced to death by the British government for her part in the uprising and sent to prison. But her life sentence was commuted to her death sentence was commuted to a life sentence, and she was released. But then she took part in the German plot and she was re-imprisoned. And it was from her cell in Holloway Women's Prison that she fought and won an election in the very first government of our nascent state, the first Dáil. And so she became the first ever female minister for state in a modern democracy. And she ended up dying in poverty on the public ward of a public hospital. And she was denied a state funeral, because that's what often happens in countries where there is, a revolution. The dust settles and the men take charge, and they seek to really erase the role that the women played in that revolution. So they tried to sort of rebrand her as a philanthropist, and she was denied a state funeral. But the people of Dublin came out, almost 500,000 people lined the streets. So she is our inspiration for her vision of a fairer and better society, and her bravery and courage.
Yeah, that point about women being put back into our place, the place that the men want us to after we've helped them with the revolution, we're in the being put back in our place moment at the moment, aren't we? Unfortunately. So what about your organisation? What are you doing in Ireland and internationally? What's your sort of big message?
Well, our original kind of goals and aims in the first instance are fairly modest, I guess, and they are our mission statement, which is to empower the people of Ireland to discuss the Gender Recognition Act and its impact on everyday life. We feel strongly that we need to have a grown-up conversation in our country about the impact on women and children. And we as a group will always centre women and children. But beyond that, in terms of the work we do, we are very deeply concerned about single-sex provision, about prisons, about sport, about safeguarding schools, children. So we are working in all of these areas specifically, and we have working groups where we are looking at the situation on the ground. So, you know, just to give you sort of some background to how this happened in Ireland, and I'm sure what we have seen is this is happening all over the world in the same way. So we have the Black Letter Law, in our case, the Gender Recognition Act, which codifies self-ID into law. In our case, there is no gatekeeping whatsoever, whether that be legal, criminal, or medical. Anyone can fill out the form, and no one has ever been refused, none have been revoked. And in our case in Ireland, only this week, a third violent male has been sent down to the female estate. And the two males before that were each in the midst of live criminal proceedings for sexual offences when their certificates were granted. So in Ireland, we're in a position where any man who wants to, even a sex offender, can simply fill out a form and be granted a gender recognition certificate. And in Ireland, the law actually says they then change their sex for all purposes. And for me, that's very, very pertinent, because for all purposes means it's not a legal fiction. It's actually an access all area pass to all of our spaces and places. And so therefore, it actually completely reorders the very basis of society, because now we have a sex class called women, including some men who identify as women. And that obviously obliterates all single sex provision for women and for girls. And, you know, sometimes people will get in touch and say, well, I'm not a feminist, but I don't think this is fair. Or sometimes people say, I'm not a feminist, but I believe in equality. And without getting into possibly a much needed conversation about structural inequality, I feel that, you know, the thing to remind people is that we need single-sex provision in order to try to achieve equality. There's no equality without single-sex provision, you know, and people are now, I think, waking up to things that were put into motion 20 years ago. We're now feeling the impact on the ground. But
Lisa, are you saying, do you think that there's sort of more support for our position now in Ireland? Are women and people in Ireland waking up to the problems?
Yes, I think so. Over the last 6 months, 5 different groups have formed: Women's Space, LGBT Alliance, Radicaline, ourselves, and Irish Women's Lobby. And so just by making that, by shifting the conversation, I think people feel empowered to discuss it. I mean, I've even noticed, even in the last few weeks, more and more women, Irish women on Twitter, are using their names and using our hashtag, which is we will be heard. And, you know, we certainly have, you know, rattled a few people. There was an open letter that was put out calling on groups like us to be disenfranchised. But, you know, things like that can turn into a bit of an own goal, because the thing to remember, I think, is that these laws are deeply unpopular. And once people start discussing them, you quickly find that our position is not an extreme or fringe position. This is the position of 9 out of 10 people. It's just that we need to try to explain to people, you know, that this is not about a tiny minority who seemingly live in a vacuum. It's about, you know, looking at, like we do with everything else in life, looking at the common good and the conflict of rights.